A hardened cop finds a young girl sleeping on a park bench every night. When he approaches, her words stun him. She's not homeless. She's waiting for a father who may never return. The truth is heartbreaking. Her dad, a broken war veteran, is lost in his own demons. But when the cop finally finds him, tragedy strikes. The father is arrested, leaving the girl completely alone. Now, the cop faces an impossible choice: walk away or risk everything to save her. Stay to the end, because this story will change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The bitter October wind whistled through Willow Creek Park, rustling dead leaves across empty pathways. Officer Mark Reynolds guided his patrol car slowly along the curved road, his headlights cutting through the darkness. At 10:45 p.m., the park should have been deserted, and it almost was. Almost. His trained eye caught something unusual on one of the wooden benches near the playground. He slowed the car, squinting through the windshield. A small figure sat perfectly still, curled up against the cold. Mark's jaw tightened. After 20 years on the force, he knew what this usually meant. Another runaway, another kid with nowhere else to go. His stomach knotted with the familiar mix of concern and resignation that came with these situations. He parked the car and stepped out into the biting cold. The figure didn't move, didn't even look up as his boots crunched on the frost-covered grass. As he got closer, he could make out more details. A young black girl, couldn't be more than 11 or 12, wrapped in an oversized military jacket that swallowed her small frame. Her shoulders were hunched against the wind, and her hands were tucked deep into the jacket's sleeves. Mark approached carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He dealt with enough scared kids to know better than to rush in. The beam of his flashlight swept low, illuminating her worn sneakers first, their frayed laces and scuffed toes telling their own story of hard times. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "Where's home?" The girl lifted her head slowly, and Mark was struck by the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. There was no fear there, just determination and something harder: defiance. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at too many sleepless nights. "I'm already home," she said, pulling the oversized jacket tighter around her shoulders. Her voice was steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands from the cold. A gust of wind whipped through the park, making the swing chains rattle in the darkness. "It's too cold for that," Mark replied, taking another step closer. The temperature was dropping by the minute and her lips were starting to turn blue. His paternal instinct screamed at him to do something, anything. "I don't need you." The words came out like steel, but Mark noticed how she shrunk further into the jacket, her shoulders curling inward protectively. That's when he saw it, the name patch sewn onto the breast of the military jacket. Carter. His eyes narrowed slightly. The jacket was well worn but clearly military issue, and about 4 sizes too big for her small frame. The fabric was faded but clean, carefully maintained despite its age. "That jacket," he said carefully, "belongs to your father?" She stared straight ahead, refusing to answer. Her silence spoke volumes. Her jaw clenched tight enough that he could see the muscles working beneath her skin. Mark took a step back, shoving his hands in his pockets. The wind picked up, sending a shower of dead leaves skittering across the playground. He knew he couldn't force her to talk. That would only make things worse. But every instinct told him something was very wrong here. 20 years of police work had taught him to trust those instincts. "Look," he tried again, "I can help." "I said I don't need you." She cut him off, her voice sharp but trembling slightly from the cold. "Just leave me alone." Her words carried the weight of someone who'd learned the hard way not to trust easily. Mark sighed heavily, his breath visible in the frigid air. He'd seen this before, the steel wall of distrust, the fierce independence masking something deeper, something broken. His chest ached with memories of other kids he'd found in similar situations, some with happier endings than others. He retreated to his patrol car, sliding behind the wheel but leaving the engine off. The dashboard clock read 11:15 p.m. Through the windshield, he could still see her small form on the bench, stubborn and still as a statue. The moon cast long shadows across the park, making her seem even more alone. This wasn't his problem. He had reports to file, other areas to patrol. The logical part of his brain told him to call it in, let social services handle it. But something about her stillness, her quiet determination to survive whatever she was facing alone, wouldn't let him drive away. It stirred memories he usually kept buried, of another young girl who'd needed protection, one he couldn't save. He sat there in the darkness, watching. The temperature gauge on his dashboard showed 28 degrees and dropping. She wouldn't last much longer out here alone. Not in this cold, not at this hour. But for now, all he could do was wait and watch, knowing in his gut that this girl's story was far from over. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he settled in for what promised to be a long night. The next evening, Mark sat in the parking lot of Joe's coffee shop, staring at the steaming cup in his cup holder and the thick fleece blanket on his passenger seat. He'd told himself all day he wouldn't come back. It wasn't his problem. But the image of that little girl alone in the freezing night had haunted him through his entire shift, gnawing at his conscience with each passing hour. "Just coffee and a blanket," he muttered to himself, starting the car with a resigned sigh. "That's all." The park was even colder tonight, frost already crystallizing on the grass like tiny diamonds in the darkness. His headlights swept across the familiar bench, and there she was, exactly where he'd left her. She hadn't moved, still wrapped in that oversized military jacket, her small form rigid against the cold, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Mark grabbed the coffee and blanket, approaching slowly, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. The girl watched him with sharp, distrustful eyes as he set the cup beside her on the bench. Without a word, he moved to the next bench over and sat down, pulling out his own coffee, letting the warmth seep into his cold, numbed fingers. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant hum of city traffic. From the corner of his eye, he saw her reach for the cup, her fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the warm cardboard, seeking its comfort. "Cops don't help people like me," she finally said, her voice quiet but fierce, each word carrying the weight of experience. Mark took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. "Maybe they should." Another long silence followed. The girl pulled the jacket tighter around herself, and now Mark could clearly see the name patch in the dim light. Carter. The letters were slightly faded, but still clearly visible against the dark fabric. "He's coming back," she said suddenly, as if answering an unasked question, her words carrying a desperate certainty. "He always comes back." Mark kept his voice neutral, careful not to let any judgment seep through. "Who does?" "My dad." Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance. "He's a Marine. David Carter." There was pride in her voice, but also something else. Worry, maybe fear, threading through her words like a dark current. "Sometimes he needs time to sort things out, but he always comes back for me." Mark's chest tightened. He knew what that usually meant, had seen it too many times before in his years on the force. Veterans struggling to readjust, fighting battles long after they'd left the battlefield, leaving scattered pieces of themselves and their families in their wake. "How long has he been gone this time?" he asked carefully, treading gently around the raw edges of her pain. The girl's fingers tightened around the coffee cup until her knuckles showed white. 12 days, she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "But he'll come back. He has to." Mark felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his stomach like lead. 12 days. Much too long for a child to be alone, waiting in the cold, holding on to hope like a lifeline. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. She hesitated, then lifted her chin with a mix of pride and defiance. "Lena. Lena Carter." Mark nodded, finishing his coffee in silence. At 10:15, he stood up, noting how Lena had wrapped herself in the blanket he'd brought, her small form almost disappearing into its folds. Back in his patrol car, he stared at his hands on the steering wheel, his wedding ring catching the dim light from the dashboard. He wasn't supposed to get involved. This wasn't his case, wasn't his problem. He had enough on his plate already without taking on a missing veteran and his abandoned daughter. Tomorrow morning, he told himself, he wouldn't run David Carter's name through the system. He wouldn't look for patterns, wouldn't check recent arrests or hospital admissions. He wouldn't get involved. But as he started the car, the engine rumbling to life in the quiet night, he already knew that was a lie. Some cases just wouldn't let you walk away, no matter how hard you tried. The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed overhead as Mark settled into his desk chair, coffee growing cold beside his keyboard. The late-night shift was quiet except for the distant sound of phones ringing and keyboards clicking. He shouldn't be doing this, it wasn't his case. There wasn't even a case. But his fingers moved across the keys anyway, typing, David Carter. The database churned for a moment, the loading circle spinning hypnotically before spitting out results. Mark's eyes scanned the screen, each detail painting a clearer picture of the man whose jacket his daughter now wore. His jaw tightened with each new piece of information. David Carter, 42, former Marine, distinguished service in Afghanistan, with multiple commendations and a Purple Heart. But what followed his military career told a different story. A steady stream of minor offenses spanning the last 5 years. Public intoxication, sleeping in abandoned buildings, disturbing the peace, petty theft from convenience stores. The mugshots showed the same face with increasingly hollow eyes, a man slowly disappearing into himself. Mark printed the file and grabbed his jacket, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The November wind bit through his coat as he made his rounds, dead leaves skittering across the sidewalk at his feet. First stop, St. Mary's Shelter. David Carter? The shelter worker, Betty, shook her head. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and worry lines creased her forehead. She nervously adjusted her worn cardigan. Haven't seen him in weeks. He used to come in regular, you know. Always polite even when he was having rough days. But lately... She trailed off, wringing her hands. He stopped taking his meals here. Stopped talking to the counselors, too. The VA clinic yielded similar results. Empty chairs in the waiting room, veterans shuffling past with downcast eyes, the antiseptic smell hanging heavy in the air. No one had seen David. His last appointment had been missed. Then another, then another. By early afternoon, Mark found himself at an AA meeting in the basement of First Presbyterian. The coffee was terrible, bitter, and burnt, but the stories were raw and honest. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on tired faces as people shared their struggles. After the meeting, a veteran with a scraggly beard and kind eyes approached him. "You asking about David?" The man introduced himself as Tommy, his handshake firm but gentle. "Last time I saw him was under the Lincoln Street Bridge. He wasn't doing so good, man. PTSD's been eating him alive since he got back. Some nights he'd just sit there staring at nothing, jumping at every car that passed overhead." Mark nodded, jotting down notes in his worn pocket notebook. "How long ago was this?" "Maybe 3 weeks. He talked about his kid a lot. Little girl. Said he needed to get clean for her, but..." Tommy shrugged, pain evident in his eyes, his fingers fidgeting with his sobriety chip. "Sometimes the demons win, you know? War follows you home in ways civilians can't understand." The sun was setting by the time Mark pulled up near the Lincoln Street Bridge, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The underpass was a known homeless camp, littered with cardboard boxes and shopping carts, the concrete walls covered in faded graffiti. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the growing darkness as he scanned the area. There were signs of recent habitation. A worn sleeping bag, empty bottles, food wrappers, and a military-issue duffel bag partially hidden behind a concrete pillar. Mark crouched down, examining the camp. The sleeping bag was damp from recent rain, abandoned for at least a few days. A dog-eared photo lay nearby, protected in a plastic bag, a younger David in uniform, smiling proudly. In the fading light, Mark stood under the bridge, staring at the makeshift camp as traffic rumbled overhead. The pit in his stomach grew heavier with each passing moment. David Carter's daughter was still sitting on that park bench, waiting for a father who might not come back this time. The thought of her there, alone and hopeful, made his chest ache with a familiar pain. The Lincoln Street underpass loomed ahead, a concrete cave where shadows gathered even in broad daylight. Mark's footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the gloom, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The smell hit him first: unwashed bodies, stale alcohol, and desperation. The walls were covered in graffiti, years of spray-painted pain and anger creating a twisted mural of urban decay. That's when he saw him. David Carter lay curled on a dirty blanket, surrounded by empty bottles and discarded food wrappers. His military jacket, identical to the one Lena wore, was caked with mud and other substances Mark didn't want to identify. A shopping cart filled with aluminum cans stood guard nearby, a homeless man's treasure chest. David Carter? Mark kept his voice steady, professional, though his heart ached at the sight. The man's eyes flickered open, bloodshot and unfocused. His hands shook violently as he tried to push himself up, but his arms gave out. Mark knelt beside him, close enough to see the cold sweat on David's forehead, the tremors racking his body. The stench of cheap liquor hung heavy on his breath. "Your daughter is waiting for you," Mark said softly, thinking of Lena's hopeful face. David's laugh was hollow, breaking into a wet cough that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "She shouldn't wait." His words slurred together, but the pain in them was crystal clear. "She's better off forgetting me." "Then come back with me." Mark reached out, offering his hand. "Let me help you get cleaned up. She needs her father. You can still make this right." "No." David's eyes cleared for a moment, filling with tears that carved clean tracks down his dirt-stained face. "I can't face her. Not like this. Not ever again." His voice cracked. "You don't understand what I've done, what I am, the things I've seen." "You're her father," Mark insisted, his voice firm but gentle. "That's what matters to her. That's all she sees when she looks at you." "I was her father," David corrected, his words sharp with self-loathing. "Now I'm just... this." He gestured at himself, at the bottles, at the filthy corner he'd claimed as home. A rat scurried past, making him flinch. "She deserves better than watching me destroy myself." Mark tried again. "She's sleeping on a park bench waiting for you to come home. That's not better. She needs you, David." "Then help her." David's voice rose, echoing under the bridge, startling a flock of pigeons into flight. "Because I can't. I can't stop seeing their faces. Can't stop hearing the explosions. Can't..." His words dissolved into quiet sobs that shook his entire frame. Mark watched the man break down, recognizing the haunted look in his eyes. He'd seen it before, in veterans who couldn't leave the war behind, in good men destroyed by memories they couldn't escape. The weight of unseen horrors seemed to press David into the concrete. "Let me get you into rehab," Mark offered, his voice gentle but urgent. "There are programs for veterans, people who understand what you're going through." "I've tried," David cut him off, his voice raw with defeat. 3 times. Couldn't stick with it. The quiet's worse than the noise." His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he reached for an empty bottle. "Just go. Please, let me die in peace." Mark stood up slowly, hands on his hips. The afternoon light at the edge of the underpass seemed impossibly bright compared to the darkness where David lay. If he walked away now, he knew what would happen. Another veteran lost to his demons, another body to find when the cold or the alcohol or the loneliness finally won. Another child left without a parent. He looked down at David Carter, seeing not just the broken man before him, but the soldier he'd been, the father he could still be. In David's haunted eyes, he caught glimpses of the man Lena so desperately believed in. The choice weighed heavy on his shoulders as the minutes ticked by, each second marked by the distant sound of traffic above. The streetlights flickered to life as Mark sat in his patrol car, his mind cycling between Lena's determined face and David's broken one. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, creating a nervous rhythm that matched his racing thoughts. The girl was still out there, still waiting, while her father… His phone buzzed, cutting through his thoughts with its harsh vibration against the dashboard. A disturbance at Riley's liquor store, just 3 blocks from the underpass where he'd found David. Mark's stomach tightened into a familiar knot of dread. He knew, even before he turned the key in the ignition, exactly what he'd find. Some part of him had been expecting this call all evening. The patrol car's tires squealed as he pulled onto the main road, the sound echoing off nearby buildings. Red and blue lights from another police unit already painted the evening in alternating colors, creating an eerie dance across the storefronts. A small crowd had gathered outside the store, their faces illuminated by the neon open sign, whispering and pointing like spectators at a tragic play. Mark's boots crunched on broken glass as he stepped out of his car, each step a reminder of the mess he was walking into. There, pressed against the store's brick wall, was David Carter. His wrists were cuffed behind his back, his military jacket even more disheveled than before, hanging off one shoulder like a forgotten flag. The man could barely stand straight, swaying like a tree in strong wind, his legs threatening to give out at any moment. He tried to steal. The store clerk's face was red with anger, pointing an accusing finger, spittle flying from his mouth. When I caught him, he started swinging. Nearly knocked over my display, almost hit my nephew too. David's head hung low, but Mark could see his lips moving, forming words that barely made it past his throat. I wasn't stealing. His voice was thick, slurred, barely recognizable as human speech. Just needed a drink. Just one drink. To make it stop. Damn it, David, Mark muttered, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. Empty bottles lay scattered near the entrance like fallen soldiers. A shelf inside had been knocked over, its contents creating a river of alcohol across the linoleum floor, the sharp smell of spilled liquor burning his nostrils. But what caught Mark's attention were David's hands. Even cuffed, they trembled violently, like autumn leaves in a storm. This wasn't just drunkenness. This was withdrawal, raw and brutal, written in every twitch and tremor. The man hadn't been trying to fight. He'd been trying to stop the shakes, to quiet whatever demons were screaming in his head, demons that Mark could only imagine. The other officer began reading David his rights, but the words seemed to float right through him like smoke through a screen. His eyes were distant, seeing something far beyond the parking lot's fluorescent lights, perhaps back in some desert where his troubles had begun. Mark followed as they led David to the patrol car, watching as they helped him into the back seat, having to support most of his weight. The man who'd served his country, who had a daughter waiting faithfully for his return, now slumped against the window like a broken marionette, strings cut by the very battles he couldn't leave behind. An hour later, Mark stood outside the station, watching through the glass doors as David was photographed, fingerprinted, processed. Another statistic in the system. The booking officer's voice echoed through the halls, clinical and detached. Carter, David, public intoxication, attempted theft, assault. Each charge another nail in the coffin of David's freedom. Mark pressed his fingers against his forehead, trying to squeeze away the headache building behind his eyes, feeling the weight of what was to come. Somewhere in Willow Creek Park, an 11-year-old girl sat on a bench, still believing her father would come back for her. She had no idea what had just happened, no idea that the wait was about to get much longer. The thought of her sitting there, alone and hopeful, made his chest ache. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Park as Mark's patrol car rolled to a stop. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, dreading the conversation ahead. The familiar knot in his stomach grew with each passing second. Through the windshield, he could see Lena on her usual bench, wrapped in her father's military jacket despite the warming day, her small figure a lonely silhouette against the brightening sky. She looked so small, so vulnerable, yet her posture remained stubbornly straight, like a soldier standing guard. Mark's chest tightened. She'd been standing guard for far too long, carrying a weight no child should have to bear. As he approached, the gravel crunching under his boots, Lena's head snapped up. For the first time since he'd met her face lit up with hope. The sight made his next words even harder to say, like stones caught in his throat. "Did you find him?" Her voice trembled with excitement, eyes wide and searching his face. Her hands clutched the edge of the bench, knuckles white with anticipation. Mark knelt beside the bench, bringing himself to her eye level. The morning dew had soaked through the knees of his uniform, but he barely noticed. "Lena," he started, his voice gentle, almost a whisper. "I found him, but he got arrested last night downtown." The transformation on her face was instant. The hope vanished, replaced by denial and anger. Her small body went rigid, like a spring wound too tight. He wouldn't. You're lying." "He's sick, kid. He needs help. Real help this time." "He always comes back." Her voice cracked on the last word. Tears welled up in her dark eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Her chin jutted out in defiance, so much like her father's stubborn expression that it made Mark's heart ache. "I know you want to believe that, but you don't know anything." Lena jerked away from his outstretched hand as if it might burn her. "He wouldn't do anything wrong. He wouldn't leave me. Not like this." She clutched the oversized jacket tighter around herself, like armor against the truth. Her fingers traced the name patch, Carter, over and over, a nervous habit Mark had noticed before. "He wouldn't leave me," she whispered again, softer this time, as if trying to convince herself. The words hung in the morning air like a prayer. Mark watched helplessly as she curled into herself, making her small frame even smaller. The jacket swallowed her whole, and for a moment she looked impossibly young, just a little girl trying to hold on to the only parent she had left, drowning in fabric that still smelled of her father. The morning passed into afternoon, and still, Lena sat there, unmovable as a statue. Mark brought her water and a sandwich from the deli across the street, which she ignored. He couldn't force her to leave, but he couldn't bear to leave her alone either. So he stayed, keeping watch from a distance, making his rounds and always circling back to check on her, like a planet trapped in orbit. As darkness fell and the park emptied, Mark sat in his patrol car, the engine idling. Through the windshield, he could still make out Lena's silhouette on the bench, a lonely figure in the growing shadows. Her broken voice echoed in his mind. He wouldn't leave me. The truth was, David had already left her, long before his arrest. He'd left her piece by piece, day by day, as the demons of war and addiction stripped away the father she once knew. Each missed dinner, each broken promise, each disappearance had taken another small piece of him away. And now here she sat, alone in the growing dark, clutching his jacket like it was all she had left in the world. Now Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he realized that, in many ways, it was all she had left. The leather creaked under his grip as he fought with himself. He knew he was at a crossroads. Department policy was clear about getting personally involved in cases. He had already crossed several lines by tracking down David, by checking up on Lena, by caring too much. Each step had taken him further from the safe harbor of professional distance. The clock on his dashboard read 10 p.m., its red numbers glowing accusingly in the darkness. He could walk away now, file a report, let the system handle it. That would be the safe choice, the professional choice, the kind of choice he'd made 100 times before. Or he could do something reckless, something that went against everything his years on the force had taught him about maintaining boundaries, something that might just save them both. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Mark leaned against his desk, coffee growing cold in his hands. His shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion after another long shift, his bones aching from too many hours on patrol. His partner, Jake Martinez, stood nearby, arms crossed and forehead creased with concern, tapping his foot against the linoleum floor in an irritating rhythm that echoed through the nearly empty office. "You're getting too close, man," Jake said, shaking his head. "This isn't going to end well. You know that. We've seen it before." Mark stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid ripple with his slight tremor, the bitter aroma no longer appealing. "She's just a kid, Jake. A kid with nowhere else to go. You saw where she's been sleeping. And we're cops, not social workers." Jake's voice softened slightly, genuine worry seeping through his professional facade. "Look, I get it. She reminds you of—" "Don't." Mark's tone was sharp enough to cut glass, his grip tightening on the paper cup. "This isn't about that. It was never about that." Jake sighed, running a hand through his short, dark hair. Call child services, let them handle it. That's the protocol. That's what we're supposed to do. What we've always done. The evening air had turned bitter by the time Mark's patrol car pulled up to Willow Creek Park. A harsh wind rustled through the bare branches overhead, carrying the last remnants of autumn with it. The streetlights cast yellow pools across the empty playground, and there she was, Lena, curled up on her bench like always. Her father's jacket seemed to swallow her whole, the worn denim a shield against the world, patches and tears telling stories of its own. Mark's footsteps were heavy as he approached, crunching against the frost-covered grass. She didn't look up, but he knew she was aware of his presence. She always was, like a small animal constantly alert for danger, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. "Come on, kid," he said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air like smoke signals. "You're coming with me." Lena's head lifted slowly, her eyes narrow with confusion and a hint of fear. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed countless sleepless nights. "Where?" "Somewhere warm." She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against whatever internal scale she used to measure trust. Finally, she stood, her movements careful and deliberate. The jacket hung past her knees, sleeves rolled up multiple times so her hands could peek through, fingers red from the cold and trembling slightly. The drive to his apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional squeak of worn brake pads. Mark could feel her watching him from the passenger seat, probably memorizing the route, planning escape routes. Smart kid. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Every few blocks he'd catch her reflection in the window, eyes darting between him and the passing streets, her breath fogging up the glass. His apartment wasn't much. A modest two-bedroom on the third floor of an older building, with water stains on the ceiling and radiators that clanked in the night like restless ghosts. The spare room had been empty for years now, door always closed, preserving memories he couldn't face. Mark flicked on the lights, watching as Lena took in her surroundings with cautious curiosity, her eyes lingering on the family photos he'd never taken down, dusty frames holding frozen moments of happier times. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, normal, as if having a runaway 11-year-old in his living room was an everyday occurrence. "Kitchen's through there if you're hungry. Help yourself to anything. There's leftover pizza in the fridge." Lena perched on the edge of his couch, still wrapped in her father's jacket like armor. She looked impossibly small against the worn leather cushions, her feet barely touching the floor, sneakers scuffed and worn at the toes. Mark grabbed a blanket from the closet, soft navy blue, still smelling faintly of fabric softener, and draped it over her shoulders with gentle care, pretending not to notice how she flinched at first contact. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "You're safe here. I promise." The words felt heavy with meaning, a vow he wasn't sure he had the right to make. She didn't respond, but as the clock ticked toward 10, its steady rhythm filling the quiet apartment, her rigid posture finally began to relax. Her eyes grew heavy, and for the first time in days, Lena Carter slept somewhere warm and safe, the weight of constant vigilance lifting from her small shoulders. Mark watched from his armchair, knowing he'd crossed a line tonight. Jake was right. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't what cops were supposed to do. This could cost him his badge if anyone found out. But as he watched this fierce, broken little girl finally rest, her face peaceful in sleep, dark lashes resting against pale cheeks, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Some lines were meant to be crossed, and some rules were made to be broken for the right reasons. The soft morning light filtered through Mark's kitchen window as he jerked awake to the sound of rustling. His neck ached from sleeping in his recliner. He'd given Lena his bed. A dull throb pulsed at the base of his skull, punishment for another night of fitful sleep. Following the noise, he found her standing motionless in his kitchen, staring at a box of Cheerios like it might bite her, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Her small frame seemed even tinier in the oversized t-shirt he'd loaned her to sleep in, her father's military jacket still wrapped protectively around her shoulders like armor against the world. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, telling him she probably hadn't slept much, and her wild curls were tangled from tossing and turning all night. Mark rubbed his tired face and grabbed 2 bowls from the cabinet, wincing at the loud clatter they made in the morning silence. "You can eat, you know." He kept his voice gentle, careful not to startle her, like approaching a wounded animal. Lena's shoulders tensed, drawing up toward her ears. "I don't steal food." Her voice was barely above a whisper, heavy with shame and defiance. "It's not stealing if someone gives it to you." Mark pushed a bowl toward her, along with the milk and cereal. She watched him pour his own bowl first, studying his movements with careful attention, then carefully followed suit, mimicking his exact portions. The only sound for several minutes was the soft clink of spoons against ceramic and the distant chirp of morning birds. Mark noticed how she ate, measured, controlled bites that couldn't hide her hunger. Each spoonful was precise, like she was rationing every piece of cereal, a habit born from necessity. "Your backpack's still packed," Mark said between bites, trying to keep his tone casual. "You can put your stuff in the dresser if you want. Make yourself comfortable." Lena's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, milk dripping slowly back into the bowl. "I'm fine." When Mark tried to bring up David, her face shut down completely, walls slamming into place. "Dad's coming back," she said firmly, pushing away her half-finished bowl with trembling fingers. "He always comes back," he promised. Throughout the day, Mark made discreet calls about David's case while Lena sat curled up on his couch, sketching in a worn notebook, her pencil moving in sharp, angry strokes. The lawyer he spoke with didn't sound hopeful. David's record wasn't doing him any favors, and the system rarely showed mercy to repeat offenders, veteran or not. By evening, Mark sat at his desk, staring at another number he'd been avoiding all day, a defense attorney who specialized in veterans' cases, someone who might understand the complexities of David's situation. The clock on his wall ticked past 8 p.m. as he finally picked up his phone and dialed, each number feeling heavier than the last. "James Morrison's office," a tired voice answered, echoing the exhaustion Mark felt in his bones. Mark took a deep breath, watching Lena through his office doorway as she dozed on the couch, still clutching her father's jacket like a security blanket. "Yeah, this is Officer Mark Reynolds. I need help with a case involving a Marine veteran. It's complicated." Mark's footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood floor as he entered his bedroom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, stretching like reaching fingers over his neatly made bed, and his eyes drifted to the bedside drawer. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. It hurt too much most days. With slightly trembling fingers, he pulled it open. There she was, Emily. Her bright smile frozen in time, forever 8 years old in her favorite yellow dress, the one with tiny daisies along the hem, her dark hair in neat braids just like she'd insisted on wearing every day that summer. The photo was worn at the edges from years of handling, creased in one corner where he'd carried it in his wallet for so long. "Who's that?" Mark startled at Lena's voice, his heart jumping. He hadn't heard her approach, her sock-covered feet silent on the floor. She stood in the doorway, the book she'd been reading dangling forgotten from her hand, its pages fluttering slightly. Her eyes were fixed on the photo in his hands, intense curiosity written across her face. He swallowed hard, considering deflecting the question, but something in Lena's expression, that careful watchfulness she always carried, like she was bracing for disappointment, made him answer honestly. "My daughter, Emily." Lena took a few cautious steps closer, studying the photograph. Her face softened in a way Mark hadn't seen before, the usual guardedness melting away for just a moment. "She's pretty," Lena said quietly, her finger hovering near but not quite touching the photo's edge. She paused, then added even more softly, "What happened?" The familiar ache bloomed in Mark's chest, spreading like ice through his ribs. He carefully placed the photo back in the drawer, his movements deliberately gentle. "She's gone." Lena didn't say anything else, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that hit Mark like a physical blow. She knew that kind of loss. Maybe not the same, but loss nonetheless. The constant waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. The empty spaces where a loved one should be. They stood in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light growing dimmer around them. Then Lena wandered back to the couch, picking up her book again. But every few minutes, Mark noticed her gaze drifting toward his bedroom door, toward where she knew that photo lay, as if the image had burned itself into her mind. Later that evening, after Lena had fallen asleep watching TV, her face peaceful for once, Mark pulled out David's case file again. The hearing date jumped out at him in bold black letters, 2 weeks from now. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him like a physical burden. Standing up, Mark grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. He glanced at Lena's sleeping form on the couch, making sure she was truly asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily, before heading to the door. The drive to the county jail would take about 20 minutes and visiting hours would be ending soon. He needed to move quickly. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, his heart felt heavier than usual, weighted down with memories and responsibilities. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, but Mark barely noticed the beautiful display. His mind was too full of 2 broken families, his own lost daughter, and now this girl who needed someone to fight for her father. The parallels weren't lost on him, even as he tried to push the thoughts away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail's visitor room, casting harsh shadows across David Carter's face as guards led him inside. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, evidence of weight lost during his time inside. Dark circles rimmed his eyes and his cheekbones stood out sharply against his skin. Though his eyes were clearer now, forced sobriety had done that much. His hands still trembled slightly, and his fingers fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. When he saw Mark sitting at the metal table, David's whole body tensed. His steps faltered before he took the seat across from the officer, the metal chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Officer Reynolds," David said, his voice rough from disuse, barely carrying across the space between them. Mark didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Lena's waiting for you." His badge caught the harsh light as he shifted in his chair. The words hit David like a physical blow. He flinched, his shoulders hunching forward as if to protect himself from the truth. "I told her to stop waiting." "She won't. You know that." Mark leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold metal table. His voice dropped lower, almost gentle, though the steel beneath it remained. "She's 11 years old, sleeping on park benches because she believes in you. She's out there right now carrying that old backpack of hers, trying to be brave." David's jaw tightened, his eyes growing wet. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "I don't deserve her." The sound of Mark slamming a file onto the table echoed through the room like a gunshot. A guard glanced over, hand instinctively moving to his belt, but Mark ignored him. "Then earn her back." David stared at the manila folder, confusion crossing his features. His fingers twitched, wanting to reach for it but holding back. "I got you into a VA rehab program," Mark explained, opening the file with practiced efficiency. "But you have to take it. It's 6 months minimum. You'll get counseling, treatment for PTSD, job training, everything you need to get back on your feet. They've got good people there, people who understand what you've been through." David's hands shook as he flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the documents in disbelief. The pages rustled beneath his trembling fingers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You'd really do this? For me?" "For Lena," Mark corrected, though his tone had softened. "And for you. The judge already agreed. Instead of jail time, you go straight to the VA program. But you have to commit. No walking away this time. No more excuses." David ran his fingers over the papers, tracing the words like they might disappear. His military training was still visible in his posture, even now. Back straight, shoulders squared, fighting an internal battle that showed in every line of his face. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted quietly, shame coloring his words. "You can," Mark said firmly, meeting David's gaze. "But you have to want it. Really want it. Not just say the words." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of doors closing and guards talking. The fluorescent light continued its relentless buzzing overhead. Finally, David looked up, his eyes red but determined. "When do I start?" Mark stood up, gathering the papers with careful precision. "I'll have your lawyer bring the paperwork tomorrow. Sign it, and we'll transfer you by the end of the week." David nodded, his hands clasped tightly together until the knuckles showed white. As guards came to escort him back, their boots echoing on the concrete floor, he turned to Mark one last time. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't express. Mark drove home in silence, his mind replaying the conversation. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across his face as he navigated the empty streets. It was nearly 11 when he unlocked his apartment door. The TV cast a soft blue glow across the living room, where Lena lay curled up on the couch. She clutched her father's military jacket like a security blanket, her small fingers wrapped in the worn fabric, her face peaceful in sleep. Mark stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe, remembering another little girl he used to watch sleep. Then he quietly turned off the TV and the lights, leaving only the soft glow of a small lamp in the corner to keep the darkness at bay. The morning sun filtered through Mark's kitchen window, casting warm patches on the worn linoleum floor. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the small space as Mark moved around the kitchen, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. A few dishes from the night before still sat in the sink, testament to their exhaustion after yesterday's events. Lena sat at the table, pushing her food around with her fork, shoulders hunched under the weight of unspoken words. Finally, without looking up, she broke the silence. "Did you find him?" Mark paused, setting his coffee mug down carefully on the counter with a soft clink. "Yeah, he's going to rehab." The fork in Lena's hand stilled, her knuckles whitening around it. "How do you know he'll stay?" Mark studied her face, too serious for an 11-year-old, marked by years of broken promises and disappointments. Dark circles under her eyes revealed another restless night. He couldn't bring himself to offer false comfort. "I don't," he admitted softly, "but he's trying." Lena let out a bitter laugh that sounded wrong coming from someone so young. She pushed her plate away, the screech of ceramic against wood making them both wince. "He always tries, then he leaves again." The weight of her words hung heavy in the kitchen. The tick of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Mark saw the battle in her eyes, hope warring with experience, love fighting against hurt. She was too young to understand the complexities of addiction, but old enough to carry the scars of abandonment. "The program's different this time," Mark explained, keeping his voice steady while he pulled up a chair next to her. "It's specifically for veterans. They understand what he's been through." He hesitated before adding, "You can visit him in a few weeks if you want." Lena's shoulders tensed. "I don't want to see him." But Mark caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers unconsciously reached for the sleeve of her father's military jacket draped over the chair beside her. The worn fabric bore the familiar patches and insignias that told the story of a man who had once served with honor. The day passed slowly, filled with quiet moments and careful conversations. Mark tried to keep busy, tidying up around the house and making phone calls about Lena's school enrollment. When evening came, he checked on Lena before bed. She lay on the pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling, her father's jacket clutched to her chest like a security blanket. Without saying anything, Mark sat on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked softly under his weight. In the dim light from the hallway, he could see the tears she was trying so hard to hold back. For the first time since he'd brought her home, she didn't pull away from his presence. Instead, she lay there, allowing herself to be vulnerable, allowing someone else to witness her pain. The silence between them spoke volumes, about trust slowly building, about wounds starting to heal, about the long road ahead. The distant sound of traffic and the gentle hum of the heating system created a peaceful backdrop to their shared moment. Mark stayed there, a steady presence in the darkness, watching over a child who had been forced to watch over herself for far too long. The VA rehab center loomed ahead, a sprawling brick building with neat gardens and American flags fluttering in the morning breeze. The red, white, and blue banners seemed to wave them forward, a patriotic welcome that did little to ease the tension in the car. Mark glanced at Lena in the passenger seat. She hadn't spoken a word during the 40-minute drive, her small hands clutching her father's military jacket like a shield against whatever waited inside. As he pulled into a parking space near the entrance, Mark turned to face her. "You don't have to do this." Lena's voice came out barely above a whisper, but her determination was clear. "Yes, I do." Inside, the center smelled of disinfectant and coffee, with an underlying hint of floor wax that seemed common to all institutions. A kind-faced nurse with graying hair led them to a small waiting area furnished with worn but comfortable chairs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, creating pools of warmth on the linoleum floor. Lena perched on the edge of one chair, her eyes fixed on the door across the room. Her leg bounced nervously, a rhythm that matched Mark's own anxious heartbeat as he settled into the chair beside her. When the door finally opened, time seemed to slow down. David Carter stepped through, and Mark had to blink twice to make sure he was seeing right. Gone was the trembling, desperate man from the underpass. David stood straighter, his face clearer, his eyes sharp and present. He wore clean jeans and a fresh blue shirt that made him look more like the Marine he'd once been. He wasn't completely healed. The shadows under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands told that story. But he was trying. Really trying. Lena's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. David's eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression crumbled, revealing all the love and regret he carried. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides before dropping to his knees in front of her chair, his movements careful and deliberate. "Hey, baby girl," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Lena's lips trembled as she stared at him, her fingers still gripping the jacket like it was her only connection to him. "Are you gonna leave again?" David's eyes filled with tears, but he held her gaze steadily, refusing to look away from the hurt he'd caused. "Not this time." The words had barely left his mouth when Lena finally broke. She launched herself forward, throwing her arms around his neck. David caught her, pulling her close as silent tears tracked down his cheeks, his large hands gentle as they cradled his daughter. Mark stepped back toward the window, giving them space as father and daughter spoke for the first time in months. Their conversation started hesitantly, careful questions about how they were doing, what they'd been up to. But gradually the words began to flow more easily, like a stream breaking through winter ice. David told her about his therapy sessions, about the other veterans who understood his struggles, about learning to face his demons instead of running from them. Lena, bit by bit, shared stories about staying with Mark, about the books she'd been reading, about the art projects that helped her cope. Watching them, Mark felt his heart swell with a mixture of hope and caution. Maybe this could work. Maybe David could find his way back not just to sobriety, but to being the father Lena deserved. The trust between them was fragile, barely beginning to rebuild, but it was there, like the first green shoots of spring after a long winter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mark drove them home. Lena sat quietly beside him, but this silence felt different from the morning's tension. She stared out the window at the passing scenery, her fingers absently tracing the name patch on her father's jacket. Then, so quietly Mark almost missed it, she whispered, "Maybe he won't leave this time." Lena's pencil moved across the paper in slow, deliberate strokes, filling the kitchen with soft scratching sounds. The drawing was taking shape, a Marine in full uniform, standing tall and proud, with medals gleaming on his chest and a hint of a smile on his face. Mark watched from the counter as he prepared their evening tea, noting how she'd been unusually quiet all evening, her shoulders tense with unspoken worry. "Thinking about tomorrow?" he asked gently, setting a mug of chamomile in front of her. The steam curled up in delicate wisps, carrying the soothing scent of honey and herbs. She nodded without looking up, but her grip on the pencil tightened slightly, knuckles whitening. "I just hope he's still there." Mark pulled out the chair across from her, the wooden legs scraping softly against the linoleum floor. "Your dad's doing really well, Lena. 3 weeks clean." "Yeah." Her voice carried an edge that made his heart ache, bitter with the weight of too many disappointments. But that's what happened last time, before he left. Before Mark could respond, she quickly changed the subject, pointing to her drawing with forced brightness. Do you think he'll like it? He'll love it, Mark assured her, but worry gnawed at his gut like a hungry animal. The shrill ring of his phone jolted Mark awake at 3:15 a.m. He fumbled for it in the darkness, his mind still foggy with sleep, nearly knocking over the glass of water on his nightstand. Officer Reynolds? A woman's voice tight with anxiety. This is Nurse Chen from the VA Rehab Center. David Carter. He's gone. Left about an hour ago. We think he relapsed. The security cameras caught him climbing over the back fence. Mark's stomach dropped as he sat up, already reaching for his keys, the metal cold against his palm. Any idea where he might have gone? No, but he was acting strange all evening, agitated, pacing the halls. We should have seen the signs. I'll find him, Mark cut in, his voice firm despite the dread building in his chest. He had to locate David before Lena woke up and discovered her father gone. Again. The thought of her face when she learned the truth was almost unbearable. The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate searching. Mark checked every spot he could think of. The underpass where he'd first found David, the local liquor stores, the homeless encampments scattered throughout the city. Nothing but empty spaces and hollow leads. His phone rang again at 6:15 a.m. Mark? It's Tom from the VA shelter. Just saw your guy stumbling down the alley behind the Gas and Go on Lincoln. He's not looking good, barely keeping his feet under him. Mark's tires squealed as he made a sharp U-turn. The sky was just beginning to lighten when he pulled up to the gas station, casting everything in a gray, ghostly light that made the world feel unreal. He found the alley easily enough, and there was David, slumped against the grimy brick wall, his clothes dirty and disheveled. An empty bottle lay beside him, rolling slightly in the morning breeze, catching the weak light like a cruel reminder of his failure. Kneeling down beside the broken man, Mark shook his head. Damn it, David. David stirred at the sound of his voice, his eyes unfocused and glazed, face twisted with shame and self-loathing. He slurred, trying to push himself up and failing, his hands scraping against the rough brick. She can't see me like this. Mark's jaw clenched as he took in the scene. The proud Marine from Lena's drawing was nowhere to be found in this shell of a man before him, this shadow of what he could be. It was too late for that now. In a few hours, Lena would wake up expecting to visit her recovering father, clutching her carefully crafted drawing and hope in her heart. Instead, she'd find only another broken promise, another crack in her already fragile trust. Mark's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he stared at the man slumped in his passenger seat. David Carter looked smaller somehow, his once strong and confident frame now diminished, his shoulders curved inward with a sense of overwhelming shame. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting every line of defeat etched into his weary features. His Marine Corps tattoo peeked out from under his wrinkled sleeve, a painful reminder of the man he used to be. You told her you wouldn't leave, Mark said quietly, his voice carrying more disappointment than anger. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. David kept his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with the weight of broken promises and shattered hopes. A tear rolled down his cheek, but he made no move to wipe it away. Inside the detox center, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mark guided the defeated David through the admission process. The antiseptic smell and institutional green walls seemed to make David shrink even further into himself. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, took Mark aside while the nurses gently led David to a bed. 72 hours minimum, she explained, her voice soft but firm. He needs to stabilize before we can release him. After that, we'll reassess his condition and determine the next steps for his recovery. The withdrawal symptoms can be severe, but we'll keep him comfortable. Mark nodded, watching through the window as David sank onto the hospital bed, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on his shoulders. The weight of what came next pressed down on Mark as well, facing Lena and breaking the news to her. His car felt emptier on the drive home, David's absence like a physical presence. When he arrived home, Lena was perched on the edge of the couch, wearing her best sweater and clutching her father's military jacket. Her eyes lit up with hope when she saw him, and the anticipation in her gaze made Mark's chest ache. She'd even brushed her hair and tied it back neatly, ready to see her dad. "Is it time to go see Dad?" Mark's throat felt tight, and he moved slowly into the room, buying precious seconds before he had to crush her expectations. "Not today, kid." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. The change in Lena was immediate. Her spine straightened, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for a blow. "Why not?" "He's not doing so good right now." The words felt inadequate. But how does one explain the complexities of addiction to an 11-year-old who's already seen too much heartbreak? Mark wished he had better answers for her. Lena's fingers curled tighter around the jacket fabric, her knuckles turning white, her voice coming out small but sharp. "Did he leave again?" Mark sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "He had a setback, but he's getting help right now. He's trying to get better." "You're lying." Her words carried the weight of too many disappointments. "He always says he's trying to get better, but he never does." Her bottom lip trembled despite her effort to look tough. Before Mark could respond, she was up, moving swiftly down the hallway. The slam of her bedroom door echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, the sound of her muffled cries breaking Mark's heart. The military jacket lay abandoned on the couch, a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. Hours passed and Mark tried to keep busy, cleaning, paperwork, anything to distract from the sounds of Lena's grief coming from down the hall. The dishes in the sink, the stack of bills on the counter, they all seemed trivial compared to the pain radiating from behind that closed door. By 11:30, he sat on the couch, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The quiet sniffles from Lena's room continued, and Mark knew better than to intrude. Some wounds needed space to bleed before they could begin to heal. He picked up the drawing she'd left on the coffee table, the proud Marine standing tall, nothing like the broken man he'd driven to detox that morning. The careful details showed how much love had gone into every pencil stroke, from the crisp lines of the uniform to the confident smile she'd given her father. Mark set it down gently, listening to the continued sounds of Lena's heartache echoing through the walls, each sob a reminder of promises broken and dreams deferred. The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade cold and imposing in the morning light. Mark sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, his police uniform feeling unusually tight around his collar, the brass buttons catching the fluorescent lights overhead. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear muffled voices discussing Lena's fate, each indistinct word making his stomach clench. David paced the hallway, his hands fidgeting with the sleeve of his newly pressed shirt, tugging at loose threads that weren't there. The weeks of detox had cleared his eyes, but they couldn't erase the weight of his past mistakes. Dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent rehearsing this moment. Inside the courtroom, David stood before the judge, his voice cracking like thin ice. "I made a mistake, but I'm in treatment now. I just need more time." His fingers gripped the podium, knuckles white with desperation, sweat beading on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights. The social worker, a woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a stern expression carved from years of seeing similar cases, rose from her seat. "Mr. Carter has repeatedly relapsed. His pattern of behavior shows instability. We cannot place Lena in his custody." Her words fell like hammer blows in the quiet room, each syllable precise and damning. The judge's face remained impassive as she reviewed the files before her, the rustling of papers the only sound in the stifling air. David's shoulders slumped with each passing moment, his hope draining away like water through cupped hands. When the decision came, it was swift and final: no custody. The words echoed through the courtroom like a death sentence, bouncing off the wooden panels and marble floors. Later, Mark found David outside, gripping the courthouse railing. The city sprawled below them, oblivious to the pain unfolding above, a maze of streets and buildings bathed in afternoon sunlight. David's eyes were fixed on some distant point, seeing nothing but his own failure. "You fought for her," Mark said quietly, keeping his distance but close enough to catch him if he fell. "That counts for something." David's laugh was hollow, empty of everything but pain, like wind through an abandoned building. Not enough. His knuckles whitened against the metal railing. It's never enough. The social worker's words hung between them like a heavy curtain. Lena would enter foster care unless an alternative guardian stepped forward. The system would swallow her whole, just another child lost in its machinery, another file in a metal cabinet. Mark watched David's hands tremble against the railing, saw the defeat etched into every line of his face, every slump of his shoulders. Something shifted in Mark's chest, a decision crystallizing into certainty, as clear as morning frost on a window. At 3 o'clock, Mark walked back into the courthouse. His footsteps echoed through the marble hallway as he approached the social worker's office, each step bringing him closer to a future he'd never imagined for himself. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I need to talk to you about Lena Carter." The courthouse buzzed with quiet tension as Mark stood before the judge, his usually confident posture betraying a hint of nervousness. His police uniform felt both like armor and a burden as he faced the stern-faced judge, the polished brass buttons catching the fluorescent light from above. "Officer Reynolds, you're petitioning for guardianship of Lena Carter?" The judge's voice echoed through the wood-paneled courtroom, bouncing off the high ceiling. "Yes, Your Honor." Mark's voice came out steady despite his racing heart and the slight tremor in his hands that he carefully concealed behind his back. "Are you prepared for the responsibility?" The judge leaned forward, studying Mark's face carefully, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting. Mark glanced at Lena, who sat rigid in her chair, her father's military jacket wrapped tightly around her small frame like a shield against the world. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, before turning back to the judge. "I already am." From her seat, Lena watched with wide eyes, her fingers unconsciously twisting the jacket's sleeve until the fabric bunched between her fingers. David sat in the back row, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on his hands, his fingers interlaced so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The social worker stood up, adjusting her glasses with one practiced motion. "Your Honor, while Officer Reynolds' intentions are admirable, we believe Lena would be better served in a long-term foster home, one with experience handling children from troubled backgrounds." Her tone was professional but carried an edge of skepticism. Mark felt his jaw tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "She's already lost too much," he countered, his voice firm but respectful, years of addressing judges helping him maintain his composure. "She needs stability now, not another transition." The courtroom fell silent as David suddenly rose from his seat, the wooden bench creaking beneath him. His voice was rough but clear, like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Mark's a good man," he said, causing everyone to turn. "He's done more for her than I ever could." The words seemed to cost him something, each syllable weighted with pain, but his eyes were clear and determined, free from their usual haunted look. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose, the gold band on his finger catching the light. The silence stretched thin as he considered the situation. Finally, he looked up, his expression softening slightly. "Temporary guardianship granted to Officer Mark Reynolds." Mark released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders dropping slightly with relief. Lena sat frozen in her chair, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. As people began filing out, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor, David paused near the door. He caught Mark's eye and gave a small, painful nod before disappearing into the hallway, his steps heavy but purposeful. Mark walked over to Lena, who hadn't moved from her chair, looking smaller than ever in the oversized jacket. "You're stuck with me, kid," he said softly, trying to inject warmth into his voice. She didn't respond, but she also didn't pull away when he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling the slight tremor running through her body. Later that evening, as they drove home in Mark's patrol car, Lena stared out the window at the passing streets, her breath occasionally fogging the glass. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across their path and turning the world into a watercolor of muted colors. After what felt like hours of silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engine, Lena's whisper was barely audible. You didn't have to do that. Mark glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips, his eyes crinkling at the corners with warmth. Yeah, I did. The morning sun barely peeked through Mark's kitchen window as he watched Lena push her cereal around in her bowl, the milk turning a pale shade of brown from the chocolate pieces she hadn't touched. 2 weeks had passed since the guardianship hearing, and while she was settling in, something still felt off. Her shoulders were tense, her movements careful, like she was walking on eggshells in her own home. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, marking each silent moment. You excited about your art class today? Mark tried, his voice gentle. He remembered seeing her latest drawings pinned to the fridge, full of dark colors and sharp lines. Lena shrugged, not looking up. It's just drawing. Her spoon clinked against the ceramic bowl, creating tiny waves in the milk. Mark sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He understood her distance. Everything in her life had changed so fast. The new bedroom, new school, new routine. It was a lot for anyone to handle, let alone an 11-year-old. His phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. The caller ID showed the rehab center's number. Mark stepped into the living room, but Lena's head tilted slightly, listening. The morning light cast long shadows across the carpet. Officer Reynolds? This is Sarah from the VA Center. David's completed his initial detox program, and he's transitioning to long-term care. He's been doing really well, and his counselor thinks it might be good for Lena to visit. He's been asking about her every day. Mark glanced at Lena, who was now openly watching him, her spoon frozen mid-air. I'll have to think about that, he said carefully. Why would I want to see him? Lena's voice cut through the air, sharp and defensive. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood up. Mark ended the call and turned to face her. Because he's still your dad. The words hung in the space between them, heavy with meaning. Lena's face hardened, but something flickered in her eyes. Hurt, maybe fear. She stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. If I see him, and he messes up again, I don't want to hear excuses. Her fingers played with the zipper of the oversized jacket she wore everywhere. The drive to the rehab center was quiet. Lena pressed herself against the passenger door, watching the city blur past. Her breath fogged the window in small patches. When they arrived, Mark could feel her tension radiating through the car. The rehab center's visiting room was painted in soft blues and greens, trying too hard to feel peaceful. A few potted plants sat in the corners, their leaves dusty under the fluorescent lights. David was already there, sitting at a small table. He looked better, cleaner, steadier, his eyes clear and focused. But his hands fidgeted nervously as Lena entered, twisting a paper cup between his fingers. She stayed by the door, her father's jacket hanging loose on her small frame. David's eyes filled with tears at the sight of it, recognition and regret washing over his face. I messed up, he said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion. I know that. His shoulders slumped slightly, carrying the weight of his words. Lena crossed her arms tight across her chest. Yeah, you did. Her sneaker scuffed against the linoleum floor. Mark watched from his position near the wall as father and daughter faced each other across the room. The space between them felt like miles, filled with broken promises and midnight disappearances. But they were here, both trying in their own way to bridge that gap. A clock on the wall counted the seconds of their silence. As they began to talk, their voices too low for Mark to hear, he noticed something shift in Lena's posture. She didn't move closer, didn't smile, but her arms slowly uncrossed. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But maybe it was a start. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting warm squares of light across the floor between them. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Mark sat beside Lena on the hard wooden bench, watching her fidget with the sleeve of her father's military jacket. Her face was a mask of careful neutrality, but her knuckles were white from gripping the fabric. The familiar scent of worn leather and memories clung to the jacket, a piece of the father she remembered from better days. David Carter stood before the judge looking better than he had in months. His military posture had returned, and his eyes were clear and focused. He wore a clean button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks, and his hands were steady as he addressed the court. The change in him was striking. Gone was the haunted look that had shadowed his face for so long. "I know I haven't been the father Lena deserves," David's voice carried through the quiet courtroom. "But I want to be. I'm staying clean. I'm working. I've got a steady job at Thompson's auto shop, and I'm going to meetings every week." The social worker, Mrs. Thompson, stood up, her expression skeptical as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Carter has a history of relapses. How do we know this won't happen again? The pattern has been consistent over the past 3 years." Mark watched David's fists clench at his sides, but instead of the anger that used to consume him, David took a deep breath. His voice was steady when he responded, "Because this time, I have something to lose. I've seen what my choices have done to my daughter. I won't let her down again." Lena shifted in her seat and Mark noticed her grip tighten on the jacket. Her face remained carefully blank, but her eyes never left her father. A single tear threatened to escape, but she blinked it back stubbornly. The judge turned to Lena, his expression softening. "Young lady, would you like to say anything?" Lena stood slowly, her small frame straight and determined. "I don't know if he'll mess up again." She paused, glancing first at David, then at Mark. Her voice trembled slightly but grew stronger as she continued. "But I don't want to lose him forever. He's trying. Really trying this time." The judge nodded thoughtfully, reviewing the papers before him. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up. "Given Mr. Carter's consistent progress in rehabilitation and his commitment to recovery, the court grants monitored visitation rights. These visits will be supervised for the first 3 months, with reviews to follow." David's shoulders sagged with relief, and for a moment Mark thought he might cry. The tough exterior cracked just enough to show the emotion underneath. Later, outside the courthouse, David crouched down to Lena's level. The afternoon sun caught the moisture in his eyes as he spoke softly but firmly. "You don't have to trust me yet, but I'm gonna earn it. One day at a time, baby girl. I promise." Lena stood still, studying her father's face. Then, slowly, deliberately, she nodded. For the first time that day, the ghost of a smile touched her lips. The late afternoon sun cast warm shadows across Mark's apartment as Lena meticulously arranged the plates on the dining table. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as she adjusted each fork and knife to perfect alignment. She'd changed her outfit 3 times already, though she'd deny being nervous if anyone asked. The last outfit, a blue sweater and her nicest jeans, felt right, even if her hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with the hem. Mark leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her fuss over the place settings. The smell of pot roast and herbs filled the apartment. "He's not gonna bite, you know," he said with a gentle smile. Lena shot him a look, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. "I know that," she muttered, adjusting a napkin for the 4th time. Her fingers smoothed invisible wrinkles from the white cloth. The doorbell rang at exactly 5 o'clock. Lena froze, her hand still on the napkin. Mark squeezed her shoulder as he passed by to answer the door, his footsteps steady and reassuring on the hardwood floor. David stood in the hallway, clean-shaven and wearing a pressed button-down shirt that still had visible creases from the store. In his hands, he held a carefully wrapped rectangular package. His eyes darted around the apartment before settling on Lena, taking in every detail of the home she now shared with Mark. "What's that?" Lena asked, eyeing the package suspiciously. She stood half-hidden behind the dining room table. David cleared his throat. "A peace offering," he said, holding it out to her. His hands trembled slightly, but his grip remained firm. Lena took the package slowly as if it might disappear. Her fingers worked carefully at the wrapping paper, revealing a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of professional charcoal pencils. She ran her fingers over the smooth cover, tracing the embossed patterns along its spine. "Figured you could use something to draw in," David said softly. "The lady at the art store said these were good ones." Lena looked from the sketchbook to her father, then back again. After a moment, she nodded. Thanks. Her voice was quiet but sincere. The initial silence at dinner was thick enough to cut with a knife. The only sounds were forks scraping against plates and the quiet hum of the heating system. But gradually, like ice melting in spring, the tension began to thaw. The aroma of home-cooked food seemed to help bridge the gap between them. "How's the art class going?" David asked, serving himself some more potatoes. The serving spoon clinked against the bowl. "It's okay," Lena said, pushing her peas around her plate. "We're learning about shading techniques, light and shadow stuff." "Yeah? Maybe you could show me sometime?" Lena glanced up, studying his face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded. "Maybe." She speared a piece of pot roast with her fork. Mark sat back, watching father and daughter navigate their way through conversation. He noticed how David's hand stayed steady as he ate, how his eyes remained clear and focused. He saw how Lena's shoulders gradually relaxed, how she started making eye contact instead of staring at her plate. The change was subtle but unmistakable. They moved to the living room after dinner, where Lena actually showed David some of her recent sketches. His genuine interest in her work brought a small smile to her face, the kind Mark hadn't seen in weeks. She explained each drawing with growing enthusiasm, pointing out details and techniques she'd learned. As the clock approached 10, David stood up, brushing off his pants. "I should probably get going." He lingered for a moment, as if memorizing the scene. Lena fidgeted with her new sketchbook, then looked up at him. Her fingers traced the edge of the cover. "You can come back next week," she said quietly. David's breath caught audibly in his throat. His eyes glistened slightly in the soft lamplight. "I'd like that," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The words hung in the air like a promise. The spring afternoon was warm as Mark's patrol car pulled into the Veterans Resource Center parking lot. The familiar red brick building stood welcoming in the sunlight, its windows gleaming. Lena fidgeted with the zipper of her backpack, no longer wearing her father's oversized jacket, but a properly fitting denim one instead. Her dark hair was neatly braided, another small sign of the stability she'd found. "Ready?" Mark asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. His voice carried the gentle steadiness she'd come to rely on. Lena nodded, her expression careful but open. 6 months had changed so much. David stood waiting at the entrance, his stance relaxed and confident in his resource center polo shirt. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by something steadier, something that spoke of hard-won peace. "There's my girl," David said warmly as they approached. His smile reached his eyes now, unlike the hollow expressions of before. Lena didn't rush to hug him, but she did step closer, allowing a small smile to break through her usual reserve. Inside, David led them through the center's corridors, his steps sure and purposeful. "We've got counseling rooms here," he explained, gesturing to comfortable spaces filled with soft chairs and calming artwork. "And over there's where we help vets with paperwork and job applications. We've helped 20 veterans find work just this month." Lena watched quietly as various veterans greeted her father with easy familiarity. The respect in their voices was unmistakable. "Hey, David," called one man, waving from behind a computer. "Thanks for helping with those forms yesterday. Got the interview tomorrow." As they passed the lobby, an elderly veteran in a worn service cap struggled with his untied shoelace. Without hesitation, David knelt down, his movements gentle and assured. "Let me help you with that, sir," he said, carefully securing the lace with steady hands. The simple kindness of the gesture made Lena's breath catch, remembering times when her father could barely tie his own shoes. Later, they sat on a wooden bench outside the center, enjoying the afternoon sun that warmed their faces. David looked at his daughter and Mark, his eyes bright with emotion and unshed tears. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you two," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Lena glanced between the two men who had become her family, feeling the weight of their journey together. "I guess we're all kind of stuck with each other now," she said, her voice soft but certain, a hint of playfulness creeping in. The day passed quickly, filled with quiet moments and shared smiles, and soon they found themselves on Mark's back porch, watching the sky paint itself in oranges and pinks. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Lena pulled her sketchbook from her backpack, the same one David had given her months ago, now well worn with use. She flipped through pages of practice drawings past landscapes and portraits until she found what she was looking for. There, captured in careful charcoal strokes, was a portrait of the three of them. She'd caught Mark's gentle smile, the crow's feet at his eyes, David's proud stance and clear gaze, and her own cautious happiness. The shading showed how far her skills had come. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, just like their newly formed family. David's throat worked as he looked at the drawing, his fingers hovering over the page as if afraid to touch it. "That's a good one," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. His hands were steady now, no longer shaking like they used to. Mark chuckled warmly, his arm resting on the back of the bench. "It's perfect," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Lena smiled softly, running her fingers along the edge of the paper, feeling its familiar texture. For the first time since everything had changed, she truly believed it might stay this way. The broken pieces had come together to form something new, something stronger than before. The evening light filtered through Mark's apartment windows as Lena sat at the dining table, her charcoal pencil moving smoothly across the paper. The scratch of graphite against the page mixed with the gentle sizzle of whatever Mark was cooking. It smelled like garlic and onions. The peaceful routine they'd built over the months felt comfortable. Normal even, like they'd been doing this forever instead of just since winter. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. When he saw David's name, he turned down the stove burner, his hand hesitating for just a moment. "Hey, what's up?" David's voice came through strained, different from his usual steady tone these days, tight with an emotion Mark couldn't quite place. I need to talk to you." Mark's stomach tightened, that old cop instinct kicking in. "What's wrong?" "Can you meet me at the center?" Glancing at Lena, who remained focused on her drawing, her dark curls falling forward over her face, Mark weighed his options. Telling her might worry her unnecessarily, but not telling her felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd built over these past months. "Give me 20 minutes, he said quietly, opting for caution. At the Veterans Center an hour later, Mark found David sitting on the curb, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, and a cool breeze carried the scent of newly cut grass. "Talk to me," Mark said, settling beside him on the rough concrete. David rubbed his face roughly, exhaustion evident in every movement, every line of his body. "I almost slipped." "But you didn't." "Yeah, but I wanted to." David's voice cracked slightly. He explained about the coworker, the invitation to the bar, the 20 long minutes sitting in his car in the parking lot, fighting the urge that never really went away that kept whispering in his ear. Mark let out a slow breath, relief mixing with lingering tension. "You called me instead of drinking. That means something." David's voice was barely above a whisper, raw with emotion. "I don't want to mess this up." Mark squeezed his shoulder firmly. "Then don't." They sat in silence for a while, watching cars pass on the distant street, before David spoke again. "Some days it's harder than others. Harder than I expected." He shook his head, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "I thought once I got through the first few months—" "You need to tell Lena," Mark said gently, knowing the weight of what he was asking. "She deserves to know." David's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. Yeah, I know." The drive back to the apartment was quiet, heavy with anticipation. When they walked in, Lena looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes moving between them, taking in their serious expressions. She could sense something was wrong. She'd always been good at reading people, too good sometimes. David took a deep breath and said the words that could change everything. "I almost messed up today." Lena's eyes widened, her charcoal pencil freezing mid-stroke, leaving an unfinished line across her drawing. The tension in Mark's apartment was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lena's knuckles turned white as she gripped her sketchbook, her dark eyes fixed on her father. Her fingers traced nervous patterns along the worn edges of the cover. "So what, you almost drank?" David's shoulders sagged under the weight of her accusation, his weathered face lined with shame. "Yeah. And you expect me to just be okay with that?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the hurt beneath her anger. She pulled the sketchbook closer to her chest like a shield. David shook his head slowly, meeting her gaze with eyes that held both regret and determination. "Number. But I needed to be honest with you. I can't hide things anymore. That's what got me in trouble before." Lena crossed her arms tight against her chest, creating a barrier between them. Her jaw clenched and unclenched. "If you screw up again, I'm done." The words came out sharp, definitive. David flinched as if she'd struck him, but nodded, running a hand over his face. "I get it. I do." Mark watched the exchange from the kitchen, feeling the familiar tension building in his shoulders. He cleared his throat. "Dinner's getting cold." They gathered around the table, an unusual sight, all three of them together. The silence was heavy as they began to eat, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against plates. Steam rose from their plates, carrying the aroma of Mark's cooking through the apartment. Slowly, bite by bite, the atmosphere began to shift. Lena pushed her food around with her fork, making little mountains of mashed potatoes before finally looking up. "So what happens now?" David set down his fork with deliberate care, choosing his words carefully. "I'm going to more meetings, 3 times a week instead of just 1, and I've got a sponsor now, someone I can call when things get rough, someone who's been where I am." Something in Lena's expression softened just slightly. She didn't smile, but the rigid set of her shoulders relaxed a fraction. Her fingers loosened their death grip on her fork. "Good," she said quietly. As they continued eating, Mark noticed small changes in their dynamic. The way Lena passed the salt to David without being asked. The way David remembered she liked extra pepper on her potatoes. The way they moved around each other, still careful but less guarded, like dancers learning new steps to an old song. When 11 o'clock rolled around, David stood to leave, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Same time next week?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "Yeah," Lena replied, walking him to the door. She hesitated, then added softly, "Just stay clean, okay?" After David left, Lena turned to Mark, her expression uncertain, bottom lip caught between her teeth. "Do you think he'll really stay clean?" Mark took a moment before answering, wanting to be honest without crushing her hope. His hands found their way into his pockets as he considered. "I think he's trying." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Veterans Center parking lot as David stepped out, his work badge still hanging from his neck. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and exhaust fumes. He was just reaching for his car keys when a familiar voice stopped him cold. "David Carter? Ain't seen you in years, man." David's shoulders tensed as he turned to face Marcus, an old drinking buddy from his darkest days. The man looked exactly the same. Same crooked smile, same weathered face, same torn leather jacket he'd worn during their countless nights at dimly lit bars. "Hey, Marcus," David managed, his mouth suddenly dry, his fingers clenching around his keys. Marcus stepped closer, clapping him on the shoulder with calloused hands that smelled faintly of cigarettes. "Come on, let's grab a drink. Catch up. The old spot's still there." David forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Can't. Got plans tonight." "Just one drink," Marcus pressed, his voice carrying that old persuasive tone David knew too well. "For old time's sake." "No, really, I gotta go." David turned away, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked his car. The key scraped against the lock twice before sliding in. Even as he drove away, he could feel the pull, that familiar itch under his skin, the whispered promises of temporary peace. Later that evening, David stood outside Mark's apartment door, gathering his courage. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly around him. He was already 30 minutes late for dinner. When he finally walked in, Lena's eyes locked onto him immediately, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "Where were you?" Her voice was sharp, suspicious, carrying echoes of too many similar conversations. David hung his jacket by the door, avoiding her gaze, noticing how his hands still hadn't completely stopped shaking. "Just talking to an old friend?" The silence that followed was deafening, thick enough to choke on. Mark watched from the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral, a dish towel gripped tightly in his hands. Lena's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Did you drink?" David's throat felt tight, constricting around the truth he needed to share. "No." He paused, then added quietly, "But I thought about it. Hard." The screech of Lena's chair against the floor made them all wince. She stood up so fast the table shook, her water glass wobbling precariously. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong." Before either man could react, she was gone, her bedroom door slamming with enough force to rattle the pictures on the wall. A framed photo of her latest art project tilted sideways. David sank into a chair, his head in his hands, fingers pressing against his temples. "I should have told her right away," he muttered into his palms. "Should have been honest from the start." Mark shook his head, but his voice wasn't unkind. "You should have told her first. She needs to know you trust her enough for that." "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me." David's voice cracked slightly, heavy with the weight of too many past mistakes. Hours later, Mark sat on the floor outside Lena's room, his back against the wall, listening to the tick of the hallway clock. The house was quiet except for the soft sounds of sniffling from behind the door. A tissue box scraped across the wooden floor inside. Finally, Lena's muffled voice broke the silence, thick with tears. "I don't want to talk to him." Mark exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of both their pain pressing down like a physical thing in the darkened hallway. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting striped shadows across the worn wooden table. Lena sat hunched over her cereal bowl, pushing the now soggy flakes around with her spoon, watching them dissolve into the milk. Her father's military jacket hung on the back of her chair, a constant reminder of everything complicated in her life. The faded name patch, Carter, seemed to stare back at her. Mark watched her from across the table, his coffee growing cold, the steam no longer rising from the dark liquid. He'd learned over the months when to push and when to wait. This was definitely a waiting moment. The tick of the kitchen clock filled the silence between them. Finally, Lena's spoon clinked against the bowl as she set it down. "I can't keep waiting for him to mess up." Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone much older than 11. Mark set his coffee mug down carefully, the ceramic making a soft thud against the wood. "You're allowed to be mad, kid." Lena's fingers traced patterns on the table's surface, her eyes fixed downward, following the grain of the wood. "I don't even know if I want to see him anymore." The words seemed to catch in her throat. "You don't have to decide today," Mark said gently, noting how her shoulders seemed to relax just slightly at those words. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he leaned forward. The day dragged on, heavy with unspoken words. When Mark's phone buzzed at 5 p.m., Lena glanced at the caller ID and immediately turned away, heading to her room, her footsteps quick and deliberate. Mark watched her go before answering, his expression tight with concern. "She's not ready," he said without preamble, his voice carrying both firmness and sympathy. David's voice came through, rough with emotion. "Tell her I'll wait as long as she needs." The words were barely more than a whisper. The week that followed was quiet. Lena threw herself into her artwork, filling pages with dark, swirling sketches that seemed to capture her turmoil. Mark noticed she'd stopped wearing her dad's jacket, though she hadn't put it away either. It just hung there on her chair like a ghost neither of them wanted to address, the sleeves empty and still. Then the letter came. David had written it by hand, the envelope slightly crumpled at the corners as if he'd held it for a long time before mailing it, the paper soft from handling. Lena took it without a word and disappeared into her room, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched it. Now, at 11 p.m., she sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the unopened envelope in her hands. The moonlight streaming through her window cast just enough light to make out her father's messy handwriting on the front, each letter carefully formed despite the natural shake in his penmanship. Her thumb traced over her name, written with such careful attention it almost looked like someone else had addressed it. The paper felt warm beneath her fingers, alive with possibility. For the first time in days, something besides anger stirred in her chest, a tiny flutter of hope she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Maybe, just maybe, she could give her dad one more chance. Not tomorrow, not next week, but someday. The letter sat heavy in her hands, waiting for her to be ready, holding all the words her father couldn't say out loud. The evening shadows stretched across Mark's living room as Lena sat curled up on the couch, her sketchbook open but untouched in her lap. Her fingers absently traced the edges of the pages, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Mark settled beside her, careful to leave enough space between them. "You got a letter from him?" Mark said quietly, watching her reaction. Lena's shoulders tensed. "I don't want it." Her voice was firm, but there was a slight tremor underneath. Mark nodded, understanding. Instead of pushing, he simply placed the envelope on the coffee table. "You don't have to read it today, or tomorrow, but it's here when you're ready." Hours later, at 2:30 a.m., Lena lay in her bed, wide awake. The moonlight filtering through her window cast a soft glow on the envelope she'd secretly brought to her room. Her hands shook slightly as she finally reached for it, carefully breaking the seal. David's handwriting filled the page, unsteady but clear. "Baby girl, I know I hurt you. I know I've given you every reason not to believe in me. But I want you to know I'm still here. I'm still trying. I won't ask you to forgive me yet. I just want you to know I love you. Always." Hot tears splashed onto the paper, creating small, dark circles that spread across her father's words. Lena hadn't even realized she was crying. The next day, Mark noticed the letter's absence from the coffee table. He said nothing, just gave a small nod to himself as he went about his morning routine. That evening, when his phone rang and David's number appeared, Mark stepped onto the porch to take the call. "Did she read it?" David's voice was anxious, hopeful. Mark paused, choosing his words carefully. She didn't throw it away. He heard David's relieved exhale on the other end of the line. Later that night, Lena sat on the porch steps, her chin resting on her knees as she gazed up at the stars. Mark stepped out, the screen door creaking softly behind him. He leaned against the railing, following her gaze upward. "Thinking about calling him?" he asked gently. Lena drew in a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the night sky. "I don't know." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Lena's bedroom window as she sat cross-legged on her bed, phone clutched tightly in her hands. David's number glowed on the screen, waiting. Mark appeared in the doorway, his familiar presence somehow both comforting and nerve-wracking. "You're allowed to be mad and still love him," Mark said softly, leaning against the doorframe. Lena sighed, her frustration evident in the way her shoulders tensed. What if he messes up again? Mark crossed the room and sat beside her, the bed dipping slightly under his weight. "Then you get to decide what happens next. Not him. You." As the evening settled in, Lena finally pressed the call button at 6:30 p.m. Her heart pounded as the phone rang. David answered immediately, his voice filled with barely contained emotion. "Lena?" She drew in a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, Dad." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then David took a deep breath. "Thank you for calling me." Lena's grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles white. "I'm not saying everything's okay." "I know. I just..." She paused, fighting back tears. "I don't want to lose you." David's voice cracked as he responded, "You won't." They talked for nearly an hour. About small things at first, then gradually about bigger things. About his work at the Veterans Center, about her drawings, about their fears. Mark moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner, catching bits and pieces of Lena's conversation. He smiled to himself, hearing the tentative hope in her voice. As the night grew later, Lena finally said goodbye and set the phone down on her bedside table. She stared at it for a long moment, the weight of her decision settling over her. In the quiet darkness of her room, she whispered, "I hope I made the right choice." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the Veterans Resource Center as David sat across from his supervisor, trying to process what he'd just heard. A promotion, better pay, more responsibility, a chance to help even more veterans. But it meant moving 3 hours away to their main facility. His first thought wasn't about the salary or the opportunity, it was about Lena. "Take some time to think about it," his supervisor said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "We need an answer by next week." David nodded, his mind already racing. He'd worked so hard to rebuild trust with Lena. Could he risk that now? At 6 p.m., he found himself sitting in Mark's kitchen, the promotion papers spread out on the table between them. "This job could change everything," David said, running his hand over his face. "But I can't ask Lena to move. Not yet." Mark leaned back in his chair, considering. "You're doing what's best for you. That's good." David sighed heavily. "But what if she thinks I'm abandoning her again?" The sound of the front door opening made them both look up. Lena stood in the doorway, her backpack sliding off her shoulder. Her eyes fixed on the papers, then moved to her father's face. "You're leaving?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the kitchen like a thunderclap. David stood up quickly. "Lena, let me explain." She walked closer, picking up one of the papers. Her eyes scanned it quickly, taking in the details of the promotion. "It's a good opportunity," David said carefully, "but I haven't decided anything yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Lena set the paper down, her face surprisingly calm. "You should go." David blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You should go," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "You always said you wanted to be better." She swallowed hard, her next words softer. "So go be better." The kitchen fell silent. Mark watched them both, ready to step in if needed, but knowing this moment belonged to them. David struggled to find words. "Lena, if you don't want me to—" "Dad," she cut him off. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither is Mark. We'll still be here." At 10 p.m., David sat in his car outside the apartment complex, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The promotion papers sat on the passenger seat, waiting for his decision. He knew he was making the right choice. The job would let him help more veterans, give him a fresh start, prove he could be responsible. But as he stared at the darkened windows of Mark's apartment, where his daughter slept, the victory felt hollow. Why did doing the right thing feel like losing her all over again? The morning air was crisp at the bus station, carrying the scent of diesel and coffee from the nearby vendors. David stood near his single duffel bag, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd been clean for 8 months now, the longest stretch in years, but this moment felt harder than any craving he'd fought. Lena stood a few feet away, her hands buried deep in her hoodie pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. The military jacket she usually wore was at home. Maybe it was too hard to wear it today. Mark stood beside her, his steady presence a comfort to them both. David took a deep breath and knelt down to Lena's level. His voice was soft but sure. "I'm gonna call you every week." "Okay," Lena mumbled, still not looking up. "And when you're ready, you can visit." "Okay." David exhaled slowly, fighting to keep his emotions in check. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "I love you, baby girl." Finally, Lena lifted her eyes to meet his. They were glassy with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "I love you too, Dad." David pulled her into a tight hug, and Lena's arms wrapped around him, gripping the back of his jacket. Her fingers dug into the fabric like she was trying to memorize how it felt. Mark watched from a respectful distance, his own throat tight with emotion. The bus doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, breaking the moment. David stepped back, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. I'll see you soon. Lena nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Yeah, see you soon. They watched as David boarded the bus, found his seat by the window. He waved one last time, and Lena raised her hand in response. The bus pulled away from the station, carrying David toward his new beginning. The drive home was quiet. Lena sat in the passenger seat, her father's old jacket spread across her lap. Her fingers traced the worn name patch absently as she stared out the window at the passing scenery. After what felt like hours, she finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it held something new, something that sounded like hope. I think he's really going to be okay this time. If you enjoyed the story of Mark, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.